Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, breaking down Chris Finch's comments on the Wolves offense a bit more related to Karl-Anthony Towns. Can we get more cap possessions this year, please? Plus, the Timberwolves signed an international player who spent the last 2 years in the NBA to a training camp contract, probably in Exhibit 10. We'll talk about him and what he'll bring to camp for the Wolves into the preseason, and also a couple more NBA free agents, veteran free agents, the Timberwolves reportedly have interest in. We'll break it all down on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. Hopefully you've had a fantastic week. A big thank you, first of all, for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Of course, you can also watch this show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV, along with all the other Minnesota Locked On podcasts. More great local sports coverage 24/7, and it's free. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku or Amazon Fire TV. Of course, the Vikings are underway. Unfortunate game for them Thursday night. 0-2, but still, it's football season. The Golden Gophers are 2-0, though. Check out Locked On Golden Gophers. The Twins are about to clinch the AL Central. The Wild kick off here soon, too. So check out all those shows over on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app. You can also follow this show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. All right, a couple of things to get to today. Quick programming note. We will be back to 5 shows a week next week, starting Monday the 18th. So get excited for that. 5 days a week will be 5 days a week through whenever the Timberwolves, actually really through the draft and free agency next year. So for the next 10 and a half months, we're 5 shows a week. So be sure you're following and subscribed. As I mentioned a minute ago, now's the perfect time to get on board. We are less than 3 weeks away, I believe, from the first preseason game, October 5th. If I'm doing that quick math right. So there's a lot to cover here in the next few weeks. Today, I do want to spend most of the day talking about potential new Timberwolves, a training camp deal the Timberwolves just signed, and a couple of other veterans the Wolves reportedly have interest in. Remember, the Wolves still do have one actual guaranteed roster spot available and a two-way spot available. So we'll talk about all that later in the show. I want to start, though, with something that I covered on Wednesday's show. So Wednesday's show, I unpacked the Chris Finch interview that he did with JJ Redick on the Old Man of the Three podcast just a little over a week ago. And it was a really, if you didn't listen to it yet, please go do so or watch it on YouTube, which depending on the podcast, I think that's a great choice. And definitely for this one, I thought it was good to read the facial expressions. And I mean, Redick and Finch are guys who worked together in New Orleans, right? Finch was the associate head coach there when JJ Redick played there towards the end of his career. And, it was a good conversation. I spent a lot of time on it Wednesday, but one of the takeaways that I had from it was how much Finch talked about more structure in the offense and also more opportunities for Cat, and talked about how Cat already was making so many adjustments and for an All-NBA player, that's rare to be asked to hey, change how you're playing, right? And in the Wolves case, it's because Anthony Edwards needs shots, right? And then Rudy Gobert shows up, and he's another big with a very different offensive game than Karl-Anthony Towns, also an All-NBA, All-Star player. So Cat's role completely shifted, and then to make matters more complicated, he strains the calf, misses 52 consecutive, 53 overall games. And so Finch talked about how he didn't want to just make Karl-Anthony Towns a shooting guard and stick him in the corner. And then one of the things I covered on Wednesday, just real briefly, is that a lot about the Wolves this last year, I was, 10 months ago, I was clamoring for right before the Towns injury, maybe the show or 2 shows before he strains his calf against the Wizards. I was pushing for the Wolves to treat their offense more like the Utah Jazz offense when Gobert was there. And this, mind you, was before Mike Conley was in a Timberwolves uniform. And I was saying that one of the challenges was D'Angelo Russell, right? Because he wanted shots. He wanted the ball in his hands. He wanted to shoot. And what the Jazz did to become the league's most efficient offense just a few years ago was Donovan Mitchell operated a lot. They did a lot of stuff with, spreading the floor around Rudy Gobert, doing a lot of pick and roll with Mitchell and Gobert. And then, Bogdanović spent a lot of time in the corner where he's like a 50% three-point shooter. That's not really an exaggeration. And well, I don't want Towns to be reduced to a Bogdanović role because as good as Bogdanović is, he's a 20-point per game scorer in this league. Karl-Anthony Towns is obviously so much more dynamic in really every other way besides quarter three-point shooting, I would argue. But when Anthony Edwards is on the floor and Rudy Gobert is on the floor, what else are you going to do besides something very similar to what Utah did? And the Wolves found that out last year when they didn't space the floor well, and they ran into, when they tried to run stuff with Cat setting screens and rolling or popping, and then Gobert was just kind of in the dunker spot and Ant was driving and the spacing. Remember, Ant had those comments early in the season about how clogged the paint was and how that was different. And he didn't, he was being, I guess you could say, refreshingly honest because he didn't really know better. But, to people who are breaking the game down, it was pretty clear that the problem was the spacing around the paint in general, right? And eventually that improved a little and the offense was passable at times as the season went on, but it was still 23rd, 24th, depending on where you look at offensive rating last year. And this is a team that was top 10 2 years ago. They add Gobert and they plummet. And now the biggest reason for that is that Towns only played in what, 23 regular season games or 29 regular season games. So we don't know for sure if they would have figured it out over the course of the season, but with that massive gap in the middle, it wasn't exactly figured out at the end of the season when Cat came back. So all that to say, when Cat's on the floor with Rudy and Ant, I'm totally fine with sticking Cat in the corner on a decent number of possessions and saying, hey man, stand out here and shoot 48% from three from the corners on kickouts from Ant, or pick and roll with Rudy if Rudy catches it and swings it to the corner, which is actually something he's pretty good at. And we saw him do in Utah, right? Kind of that short roll. Rudy catches it around the free throw line, turns and kicks it to the corner. That's not going to work every time down the floor, and defenses adjust, etc. But that worked a lot in Utah, and Karl-Anthony Towns is absolutely dynamic. And if that shot's not there, he can pump, fake, and drive. I would argue better than Bogdanović. Like, there's a lot of pros there. And then when Rudy's off the floor, Karl-Anthony Towns, the offense can completely revolve around him. Right. Like last year, for instance, I went and I looked at the, I knew that this was the case, but I wanted to pull the actual numbers. When Karl-Anthony Towns was on the court last season without Anthony Edwards and Rudy Gobert, he was absolutely dominant. Absolutely dominant. The Timberwolves, there weren't that many possessions, right? Because Cat only played in 29 games and because he often was on the court with Ant and Rudy. But if he was on the court as the lone all-star, Karl-Anthony Towns, the Timberwolves were a plus 14.3 net rating with Karl-Anthony Towns on the floor, no Ant and no Rudy. They averaged 121.1 points per 100 possessions, which is insane. Effective field goal percentage as a unit, 57%. Defensively, they were actually pretty good too. Gave up only about 107 points per possession with Ant and Rudy off the floor, which I know is unusual because the Wolves defense was very good with Rudy on the floor. So, and also, by the way, if you want to play this out a bit further and say, even Cat and Rudy I would say Cat and Ant without Rudy. I did that wrong. Let's say it's Cat and Ant without Rudy. Those numbers are still really, really good. The Timberwolves were still they weren't as good as I thought they were. They were still a +4, and they still scored 120 points per possession. But without Rudy on the floor, the defense really struggled. So defensively, they gave up 116 points per possession without Rudy Gobert with Karl-Anthony Towns. So that goes back to the point of Cat playing center. Obviously, your defense isn't going to be as good as with Rudy at center. But offensively, 120 points per possession without Rudy Gobert on the floor with Ant and I guess not necessarily with Ant, but with Cat and some of those lineups with Ant, just Cat, no Rudy. This is a 120 point per possession offense. So the point here is without Rudy Gobert on the floor, the offense should still revolve around Karl-Anthony Towns. With Rudy on the floor, the offense should revolve around Anthony Edwards, which is completely oversimplifying it. And obviously there's other things to fit in there for Chris Finch. You're not literally running every play for Ant or literally running every play for Cat. But the offense should never revolve around Rudy Gobert. You just have to consider his presence on the floor and how that best fits. And in general, it's with Anthony. It's either playing 4 out and Gobert is giving enough space for Ant to drive and then dump the ball off to Rudy. We saw that not work all the time last year. Or it's playing pick and roll game in the middle of the floor. And you're spreading with Mike Conley. You're spreading with Karl-Anthony Towns. You're spreading with Jaden McDaniels or whoever your 5th guy on the floor is. And then hopefully Rudy's getting that either rolling all the way to the bucket or he's short rolling and kicking it to the corner to Towns or Conley. And you have 2 really dynamic catch and shoot players in those quarters, just like I know it's not super exciting all the time. The Utah Jazz of 3 years ago were not the sexiest team to watch, but they were effective. And Donovan Mitchell was always fun to watch, right? And Anthony Edwards, I said this the other day, sitting here right now in September of 2023, I would not argue he's better than Donovan Mitchell. But in 6 months, we might be saying that unequivocally. Like the ceiling is still much higher for Ant than Donovan Mitchell. So at least when Rudy's on the floor, it's not a sin to replicate what the Utah Jazz did a few years ago. When Rudy's off the floor, make this the Cat show. Run 5 out with Cat on the perimeter facing up. He could shoot over 4s. He could take 5s to the rim. He can obviously pass. Last year was his best passing season overall by almost any measure. So I think there's just a lot of ways that the Wolves could take this offense this year that that will be improved upon last year. And as Chris Finch said on the podcast last week on the JJ Redick podcast, more structure is going to be key to doing this. All right. Next up, let's talk about Vit Krejci, the newest Timberwolf, albeit on a training camp contract. I want to talk about his profile as a player, what he's done in the league so far, his background, et cetera. We'll do that next. And we'll talk about 2 veteran players at the end of the show who the Timberwolves reportedly have interest in to potentially bring into training camp as well. So we'll get to all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. They're the title sponsors of today's show. Get ready for the NFL season. We're just underway with week 2 after the Vikings-Eagles game on Thursday. Incredible offers are available from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Now is the best time to join FanDuel. The app is easy to use. You can bet on everything from spreads to player props and more. Unfortunately, I'll admit, I took the Eagles to cover on Thursday night, and I was the line was 6.5, and of course, because it's Vegas, it ended up being 6 points. But hey, look, FanDuel's the place if you're going to get involved in NFL betting for this year. It is the place to bet. And again, with these deals, $5 get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed, $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV if you bet $5. Now is the absolute best time to join. Again, the app is easy to use. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season with an offer you won't want to miss. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, everydayers. Next week, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be back to 5 shows per week. And we'll get into some player previews, training camp previews. We'll take a look at the preseason schedule, all sorts of things to get to here in the next couple of weeks. And, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we'll talk about the rest of this show. There's still an open roster spot. There's probably going to be some speculation out there regarding who the Wolves could fill that spot with. So we'll break that down. What makes the most sense for the Wolves to bring into training camp? What type of player makes the most sense? So we'll get to all that here starting next week. All right, it was reported first by John Krasinski on Thursday and then confirmed by the team later on in the day that the Timberwolves would be signing Vit Krejci to a training camp deal. We don't know for sure, but there's a good chance it's an Exhibit 10 deal. Oftentimes training camp deals are. What that means, if it is indeed an Exhibit 10, is that basically he's a preferred, what I like to refer, it's almost like a preferred walk-on in college sports, where assuming he doesn't make the team, which is a fair assumption for these training camp signees, if he spends a couple of months, I think it's 60 days actually with the Iowa Wolves, then he gets a $75,000 bonus. And basically if he stays in the organization. And the Wolves usually, I think historically, almost every Exhibit 10 deal has ended up with the Iowa Wolves and has spent most of the season there. Krejci is interesting because he spent most of the last 2 seasons actually at the NBA level on the rosters of first the Thunder and then last year the Washington Wizards, or excuse me, the Atlanta Hawks. I don't know why I said the Wizards, the Atlanta Hawks. So he doesn't have a ton of G League experience. In fact, he's played in 4 total G League games over the last 2 seasons. His background is he was actually a second-round pick by the Thunder in 2020. He had declared for the draft earlier that year, started playing professionally when he was 16, by the way. So he'd been in professional basketball for a few years. Really good size. He's a 6'8", essentially a point guard, really a combo guard at the NBA level. Declared for the draft earlier in 2020 when he was 19, and then tore his ACL that fall, just like 6 weeks before the NBA draft. Which is obviously super unfortunate. He ended up still getting picked 37th. I might have seen Wizards because he was drafted by the Wizards. They traded him to the Thunder on draft night. So the Thunder acquired him on draft night. He spent a year rehabbing the injury. And then in 22, appeared in some games, or I should say, I guess fall of 21, he started appearing in some games for the Thunder. So drafted in 20, rehabs the ACL, appears in a game for the first time in 21 with the Thunder, ended up playing in 30 games, started 8 of them. Actually was a rotation guy for the Thunder in 21-22. And then he was traded to Atlanta, and basically it was a Mo Harkless salary dump from Atlanta's side, and ended up going to Atlanta last year, played in just 29 games, only 6 minutes per game last year with Atlanta. So not a whole lot. Like, we're talking 59 career NBA games. He's still only 23 years old, just turned 23 this summer. And the profile on him is, I mean, he's essentially a point forward, right? Like, really, he's a combo guard. He doesn't have the rebounding chops to be a forward. But the trick with him is I did some research on like past scouting reports before he was drafted, and then also what he's done so far in the NBA. And kind of the selling point for him was his size and athleticism coming into the draft, and then potential as a shooter and a passer, which I thought was really interesting because usually when you're talking about a 6'8" point guard, they should already be a pretty incredible passer. And that's not necessarily the case. And he's got good vision. If you go and you watch some of the cut-ups of him at the NBA level and even internationally, he makes some good reads. There's nothing, he's not like a generational passer. It's not, there's not very many wow passes. He just usually makes the right play, which is obviously very important. And then after the ACL injury, it seems as though, usually it takes a couple of years to really kind of, and now we're almost 3 years removed from that injury. But it seems like the athleticism thing, the gap, I don't want to say gap, the upside there maybe isn't quite as much as it was thought 3 years ago when he was selected. The jumper is spotty. I mean, he shot almost 60% of his NBA shot attempts are 3-pointers, but he's only 31% from outside the arc. And if you watch cut-ups of him, the shot mechanics are not the same most of the time. Sometimes he's got this weird kind of double clutch, like a leg pump that you'll occasionally see guys have, but he doesn't always have it. He dribbles into some tough shots sometimes. To me, the most exciting thing about him is obviously his size, but also he's very good in transition. He pushes the pace really well. He has tons of energy on both ends of the floor. I think he's a good defender, mostly because of that energy and the size. I actually think he could be impactful on that side of the floor. That's probably why the Wolves brought him in, is he's big and he's active. And he's got the fluidity at his size to guard backcourt guys. I could see him being a borderline, like somebody you could plug into your rotation as your 10th guy, as a situational defender to help be a big body in the backcourt. If you got guys in foul trouble, you just need to stop. I do think he's got that type of potential because of his size, his fluidity. He's got, he flips his hips really well defensively. I think he guards pick and roll well. So to me, the issue is really more, if you're going to play guard at the NBA level, you've got to shoot better than 30% from 3, or you've got to be outstanding at something else. And I don't think he's really outstanding at anything other than having great size for the position. Again, it's a combination of decent skills. Like, the shooting has some upside. The passing is good. The defense is good. The size is really good, but there's nothing that's great. The athleticism, I think, is still okay. So there is a little bit of upside. Like, if the jumper comes along and you got a 6'8" point guard that can defend and shoot, say he's shooting at a league average clip and he's a good passer, he's probably a rosterable player. Like, he's a guy you could have on your roster as a depth piece, as your third point guard, which, by the way, the Wolves don't have. So my guess is the Wolves want to get an up close look at him in training camp. Perhaps if he impresses, they could rescind their qualifying offer to Matt Ryan for the second 2-way. He could sign a two-way deal. They do still have their 15th roster spot. Really unlikely. And I said this last year when the Wolves brought in Eric Pascal and who was the, I think maybe not Moutier. I don't know if Moutier was actually in camp. Emmanuel Moutier ended up on the G League team. Like some of these veteran type guys, Krejci's a little different in that there is some upside still here because he's just 23. But I'd be really surprised if he ended up on the Wolves roster. I'm sure the thought process is let's get an up close look at him, see if there's more upside than maybe we even think there is. Maybe he's a better shooter than we expected. The free throw shooting historically is like it's really limited at the NBA level. He's attempted a total of 24 free throws in the NBA. So I don't know that that's indicative. Some of the overseas numbers aren't as good for his free throw shooting, which is a bit ominous when it comes to just in general shooting touch. Like, can he score from beyond the arc? Can he score at the rim? But again, he's good at transition, which is another thing that checks a box for the Wolves. Energy, scoring in transition, big defender, fluid athlete on the defensive end of the floor. So I get it. I would be very surprised if Vit Krejci ends up on the actual Timberwolves once we get to the actual regular season here. But we'll see him in training camp. Hopefully he'll get some preseason run and we'll get to see him a bit more up close. All right, let's close. There's two other more veteran type players, guys who have more NBA experience that the Wolves are reportedly interested in based on various reporters from around the league. So we'll get to that here next. Those names, what they potentially could bring to the Wolves if they do bring them in, and if either of them are fits for the Wolves. We'll do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at Jase Medical. If you're not familiar, Jase Medical is fantastic for everyday medical needs. The Jase case that you could get from Jase Medical provides 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use. It's really easy to get, and it really is the best reason to sign up for a Jase case is simply to protect yourself against supply chain shortages. Maybe it's natural disasters. We're heading into travel season, the fall and the winter, bad weather. Having what you need on hand with your Jase case. Again, storm shortages, pandemics, that's a recent thing. And all the supply chain issues, the reliance on China, whatever else is going on in the world. All you have to do to get your Jase case, which again is filled with life-saving antibiotics, just simply fill out an online form. And in some cases, you'll jump on a quick call with one of the board-certified physicians. You get ongoing care from their physicians on any treatment-related questions. Jase Medical is doctor created and doctor recommended. Simply put, don't be caught unprepared. Everyone should be empowered to care for themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected. Jase handles everything from online evaluation to licensed pharmacy, medication delivery, and ongoing consultation and care. The ordering process is super easy. I did it the other night in less than 5 minutes, and I'm expecting my Jase case any day. Again, you just fill out a form, you get prescription life-saving medications right to your door. Save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jase Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using my code LOCKEDON at checkout on jasemedical.com. Again, that's jasemedical.com, JASE medical.com, code LOCKED ON. All right, so the Timberwolves have been mentioned as a possibility for a couple of veteran players that are out on the market still. We'll go in the order in which these reports were made. 2 days ago, this would have been Wednesday evening, Michael Scotto of Hoops Hype listed the Timberwolves as one of 4 or 5 teams that would have interest in Lamar Stevens. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the complete fit here is, but because the Wolves were mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about who Lamar Stevens is. He was an undrafted rookie who spent 3 seasons with Cleveland and actually was a rotation guy at times for them last year. In fact, in 3 seasons in Cleveland, he played in 60 or more games twice. He averaged 16 minutes a game over all 3 seasons. So he actually played some legit minutes. Not exactly he's a power forward, maybe a little bit of undersized power forward. He's an okay rebounder for his size. He's a good defender, which I guess would be the Wolves' interest level. Like that's kind of his calling card is he's kind of an undersized 4, a little bit of an oversized 3 who can't shoot very well, but he's a good defender. So roster depth piece. The Wolves don't necessarily need anybody else. I guess they don't really have somebody like him, right? That's like a 3-4 combo at this point, besides obviously Kyle Anderson, who's going to suck up a lot of minutes at that position, and Jaden McDaniels, who will primarily play the 3. But, there isn't a Taurean Prince. There isn't like an Eric Paschall type. He's almost that sort of a body type, not quite the rebounder or passer that Paschall was. I say that as if Paschall spent time on the Wolves. He was basically just in training camp before the Wolves let him go. But if you're familiar with Paschall at this time in Utah a few years ago, is that type of a player. I think overall Stevens is a good, he will end up on a roster. There's a reason why multiple teams are interested. He can defend. I mean, again, he was a rotation guy for a good Cleveland team for much of the season last year. The problem is he's a 28% career 3-point shooter. He doesn't add a ton on the glass for the role, for the position he would play, and he doesn't really do much else beside defend. So I don't get too excited about the prospect of adding Lamar Stevens. Again, we're talking about roster spot 15. So I think it's likely it's going to be a guy that has some NBA experience, given the Wolves' expectations of where they want to go this year, which is one of the reasons why, like Vit Krejci, who we talked about last segment, I'd be shocked if he ended up with the 15th roster spot. I think it makes more sense to give it to somebody who could help you in a pinch, and your 2 ways could be spent on younger guys that, maybe are, that's kind of the purpose anyway, right? You can get them experience in the G League. You can call them up and get them experience at the NBA level in a pinch, whatever. But Lamar Stevens is somebody who, if he's your 15th guy, he's at least functional from a defensive perspective, right? He's not going to hurt you, I guess, on that end of the floor. And if he's playing in the game, you're not asking him to jack a ton of threes anyway, right? So his specialty would be on the defensive end of the floor. The other name, which is one that I think a lot of folks will be more familiar with, would be Elfrid Payton, the former lottery pick, spent last year out of the league. He recently worked out for the Timberwolves and also the Hornets. This is another Michael Scotto report at Hoops Hype. So Payton, remember, was like 10th overall from the Sixers, traded to Orlando way back, almost a decade ago, which is crazy to think about. And I really liked him as a prospect. There were a lot of similarities between him and Ricky Rubio. I remember Timberwolves fans at the time were making that comparison, mostly because he was a good defensive point guard, a good passer, and not a good shooter. And that's exactly what he was throughout his NBA career. He played, 8 seasons, I think, 7 seasons in the NBA, spent last year out of the NBA. The last team he was with was the Suns a couple of years ago, and wasn't really helpful for them. Only averaged 6 minutes per game over 50 games, was kind of their third point guard. That's the type of role, obviously, he's looking for at this point to get back into the league. I believe he played in the G League for a little while last year. He played in Puerto Rico, but trying to get back stateside. I think at this point, he's still probably a good NBA defender. Like all the advanced metrics would suggest, he was at worst kind of a replacement level passable defender at the NBA level, even with the Suns a couple of years ago, but really throughout his career. So again, you're talking about the 15th roster spot. He'd be the de facto third point guard. He could initiate some offense. But he's also a guy who, towards the end of his NBA career, he shot the ball a little bit more, and it wasn't with any greater efficiency. In fact, the worst true shooting percentage of his career was in his 50 games with the Suns. And that was also his second lowest assist rate. So I don't know if that's just, I can't explain why that would be. I can't say I watched a bunch of Peyton's minutes with the Suns 2 years ago, but all I can tell you is that this would just be, hey, we need another veteran point guard in the system, right? So what the Wolves did last year with Emmanuel Mudiay in Iowa, and of course the Wolves never ended up signing Emmanuel Mudiay to the NBA team. I'd be a little surprised, I guess, if he was brought in and sent to Iowa, but I guess that's a possibility. I mean, he's still only 29? He just turned 29 earlier. He's 29 and a half. So that's a possibility. I just don't know that there's a whole lot of upside there. Like, it feels like the Wolves have gone this far without adding another point guard. So at this point, it's Mike Conley, it's Jordan McLaughlin, and probably Shake Milton actually playing the backup point guard minutes. You've still got, obviously, Anthony Edwards is going to run some point. Nickeil Alexander-Walker is going to run some point off the bench. So I think Payton is a bit superfluous at this point. And frankly, if it were between Payton and Lamar Stevens, I think Lamar Stevens makes more sense, even if Payton serves a more clear function because he is a point guard, can play defense, can do these things. Stevens, I think, is a bit redundant, but at least I think in a vacuum, he's just a better player. And if you're talking about your 15th roster spot, it's got to be one or the other. It's got to be somebody that's really good at a certain skill, like a knockdown shooter or a lockdown defender, or it's somebody who is just a solid player that can step in and not hurt you when needed. And I think Lamar Stevens is actually a little closer to fitting both of those bills than 29-year-old Elfrid Payton at this point. So now, of course, those aren't the only options. There's still the two-way deals. There's still a qualifying offer out to Matt Ryan for for another two-way contract. Of course, the Wolves only have one filled so far. So a lot to talk about here in the coming weeks. Training camp starts in just a couple of weeks. So we'll hear a lot more of these rumors, potential training camp deals. Another two-way signing is possible. A 15th man is possible. Now, some teams will carry that open roster spot into training camp for the possibility of trades, 2-for-1 trades, absorbing somebody from another team, picking up somebody off waivers. Like, there's a lot of things that could happen here still. It's not like the Wolves have a ton of cap space, but they still have that roster spot to play with, and a little bit more than the vet minimum, I believe, in cap space available. So, that's one of the things we'll focus on here moving forward. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be back to 5 days a week starting next week. Looking forward to diving into some player previews and into some training camp stuff. And again, speculating on how the Wolves fill out the rest of the roster. So we'll get into all that stuff here next week. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.